TRE, Talk Radio Europe, your voice in Spain. Time to talk to Tony Gosling, investigative radio journalist. We have him on once a month, and delighted to welcome him back this morning. Good morning, Tony.
Hi, Bill.
So today, now this is quite interesting. I asked, it's not the biggest survey in the world, but I asked 5 people here, had they heard of Bilderberg, and only one person had, which I guess is the point of it, isn't it, really?
Well, yeah. I mean, you know, and also back in the 1990s when I was working at the BBC, when I came across the Bilderberg first, I was actually rather annoyed and irritated that I'd never heard of them.
Right.
And because you look at the list, the invite list, and quite clearly the most powerful, richest people in the Western world are all there. I'm talking about the not the 0.1%, the 0.00001%. Now, a lot of people do talk about Bilderberg as a sort of conspiracy, which it is, but it's a question of exactly what kind of conspiracy is it? I mean, Why are they trying to keep these meetings so secret when you've got a mixture of bankers, you've got usually royalty too, you've got heads of the major oil companies, you've got the most important, really, from my point of view, is the bosses of media in there too. The interesting thing, I mean, people like the places, the things like The Economist, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But the trouble is they don't actually report on it in their papers. So they're going in there, as are some of the politicians that go, well, all of the politicians that go, swearing an oath of secrecy to their conference organisers, but not to us. Yeah. So they're really betraying us as they go in. So, I mean, I first came across these in the 90s, and I thought, I looked around on the sort of early days of the internet, was there, to see what I could garner about them. And there was quite a lot of rather nasty right-wing Jewish conspiracy theories, saying this is a part of a Jewish conspiracy, blah, blah. And I just thought, look, this is not doing justice to the story, really. So that's when I set out, and I got hold of the domain name Bilderberg.org.
Right.
And I thought, because they didn't have any information at all about themselves up on the internet at that stage. And I thought, well, I'll do a whole load of research on them. And that's what I did. And that's where we are today. And I've found out some fascinating things, I think, over the years about what the origins are, etc.
Yeah, so it goes back, I believe, to May 1954, and it's called Bilderberg because it was at the Hotel de Bilderberg in the Netherlands. So what was the point initially? Why did they start this in the first place, Tony?
Well, let's talk about a couple of the figures that were involved in beginning these meetings, because obviously to get the richest and most powerful people in Europe together is not the easiest task. They've got their own things to do. You know, they've got their own agendas. So they had some pretty powerful people in order to get the first meetings going. One was probably people who'd never heard of, Joseph Rettinger. Yep. He was described as what they call an eminence grise. That is to say, he had a lot of power, he was doing a lot of stuff, but he never liked any kind of publicity. During the war, he'd been working for MI6, British Foreign Intelligence, and he'd been the aide to General Sikorski, and he was the Polish leader in exile. Yep. Sikorski was. So he was the kind of, obviously Poland was the main reason that the British entered the Second World War. So the Polish leader was quite an important figure, Sikorski. And Sikorski died in mysterious circumstances. One of the only times that Rettinger hadn't been with him in a plane crash off Gibraltar. Wow. And I spoke to, and I've looked at some of the comments of the Polish resistance to Nazi occupation. Obviously, it was a pretty horrific occupation. We know all about the Warsaw Ghetto, this sort of thing. Warsaw was absolutely levelled by the Nazis, but still people managed to survive, a bit like Stalingrad, you know. So that whole business with Joseph Rettinger is not really known. But the thing is that the locals there, they'd actually even ordered him killed. Because they believed he was actually working against Poland's interests. So this is one of the guys that started the Bilderberg. The other is probably even worse, really, and he is Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Now, he was originally a German aristocrat who'd been an SS officer and one of the first members of the Nazi Party, the NSDAP, back in the late 1920s.
Right.
So this guy had then decided he was going to change sides in the 30s, and he went over to marry into the Dutch royal family. Now, this is why I think it's in Holland. It's because of this Bernhard Dutch connection. And the trouble with Bernhard was, and he was a major figure. And why in Oosterbeek, which is where the Bilderberg Hotel is, just near Arnhem in Holland, because Bernhard had been involved, along with our own Lord Carrington, in a battle in the Second World War, the Arnhem Battle, which is in the film A Bridge Too Far.
Yeah.
And in that area of Oosterbeek was one of the most bloody massacres of the top of the British soldiers in the Second World War. As you'll see in the battle, basically they get cut off and surrounded. These are paratroopers, lightly armed paratroopers, surrounded by tanks and flamethrowers and God knows what. And there was an absolute massacre there. They called it the Witch's Cauldron in the. And this was the place where they decided to have the first Bilderberg meeting.
Okay.
So to me, it looks to me as if this is, there's a bit of an in-joke, so people who knew about it, it took me probably sort of 15 years or so to figure that out, to actually realise that there was these connections, because Bernhard had been involved in that battle. He'd been over in London, peering over the shoulder of Montgomery and Horrocks, who was involved in that battle, planning it. And then he suddenly, he sent in a spy. This is one of the sort of mystery of Arnhem. The Arnhem battle unfolds, really. He sent in a spy a few days before the battle to liaise with the Dutch resistance. That spy went straight to the German Abwehr and gave them all the plans. So he was a German spy. He was a Nazi spy within the British camp in the Second World War. In fact, the Americans wouldn't have any dealings with him. So you've got these two characters starting these conferences back in the 1950s, and Bernhard chaired the conferences for 20 years. Now, I've spoken to a guy called Philip Droog, he's the chairman of the Dutch Freelance Journalists Association, a fascinating chap, and he's written a whole book about Bernhard. And he is not liked in Holland now. He's seen as somebody that really was treacherous. Because the thing is, for the Dutch, the Battle of Arnhem was horrible because it led to what they called the Hunger Winter. At late 1944, there was horrific punishment of the Dutch, and people had no food after this battle. Lots of people rounded up, etc. And really, you're looking at it now, it looks to me as if that whole Arnhem problem, the horrific defeat of the Allied troops, was down to Bernhard, and it meant that the war. And I've spoken to some of the soldiers dead now that fought in that battle, and they said, "Oh well, if we'd have succeeded in that, getting over the Rhine, the war would have been over by Christmas." So Bernhard's actions extended the war by another 3 or 4 months, which allowed the Nazis time to get their wealth squirreled away around the world, and gave them the opportunity to create a kind of Fourth Reich, really, a financial empire.
And that's the initial group. And of course, their stated aim at the beginning, I guess, was all very lovely. It was to revive a spirit of transatlantic brotherhood based on political, economic and military cooperation.
Well, that's a bit of spin, isn't it? Because what they really wanted to do was to control Europe. This is really what it's about, forming a United States of Europe. So, Kissinger said this in the 70s himself, that he wanted one person to phone. He didn't want to phone up 30 different embassies and 30 different governments in order to get things done in Europe. Look, the main reason for the Bilderberg, and it's just the NATO countries. They're not the secret rulers of the world. If anything, they could be called the secret rulers of the NATO countries.
Right.
And it's pretty much only the NATO countries that participate in it. It was really to stop the European countries going over to the left, that is communist, etc., like Italy was. Italy was communist for years, but it never got a communist government because there was a lot of activity to stop it going that way. When I say activity, I'm talking about actually fascist bomb attacks to blame on the left wing. This is something Operation Gladio. where things like banks were. There was the most famous is probably the Bologna railway station bombing, where nearly 100 people were killed. Now, that was done by fascists, but it was blamed on the Red Brigades. So the idea is, look, the Soviet Union is infiltrating the West, and we've got to stop them. Actually, it was our own NATO intelligence forces doing these bomb attacks on ordinary innocent people, and then trying to get it to blame them on the Russians. So that was the main point of Bilderberg, was to stop any kind of friendship between Russia and the Western, the European countries during the Cold War, and it succeeded pretty well.
And so there are no minutes taking at these meetings. No report is written up after the meeting. So basically, we have no clue what goes on in there.
But we do, right? Because you can just look at, one of the best ways to do it, it sounds silly, but you just look at what people are saying straight away after the Bilderberg conference. So what they do is it's all done under what's called Chatham House rules. Yeah. And that's another program in itself if you wanted to talk about Chatham House. They're the Royal Institute for International Affairs in London, which was started by money from the will of Cecil Rhodes. He was, the guy that founded Rhodesia, the guy that basically mined and stole loads of, almost all of the resources in Africa were, he managed to make some money out of it. And at the time, the British Empire, around about the turn of the century, 1900, after Cecil Rhodes died, they decided that if we play our cards right, the British Empire can take over the world. And Cecil Rhodes had decided that he wanted to form a secret society using the money from his will in order to try and do that behind the scenes. So that's where Chatham House came from. Right. The idea was, look, this will be a private think tank, and that we'll use this to manipulate affairs around the world. So that's what, Chatham House is also called the Royal Institute for International Affairs. Effectively is probably better resource than the Foreign Office. So they do foreign policy strategy, and they are really in the driving seat when it comes to British foreign policy. These are the people we need to be looking at when it comes to things like the Iraq War, etc. They're the ones that were saying, oh yeah, well, we're going to have to take out Saddam, blah blah blah. The Foreign Office is scratching their heads and saying, well, actually, this could be dangerous, blah blah. It's a privatized version of the Foreign Office. So when you go to Bilderberg, they're using these Chatham House rules, which means that you can chit-chat as much as you want and quite freely, but you must never attribute anything to anybody. Right. So that you're never allowed to name anybody. So you can discuss what they're talking about, no problem at all, but you mustn't let anybody know where you heard it. You mustn't mention Bilderberg, and you mustn't mention Kissinger or anybody else on what they're saying. So the idea is that the things discussed at these meetings just sort of appear to happen. Right. So when they're planning something, whether it's a war, whether it's some kind of change to society, everyone will start talking about it more. I noticed this amazingly last year with them when they started talking about, they had somebody there to talk about plastic. And we've spent the whole of the last year hearing about how terrible plastic is and how we've got to do something about it. Now, that's a good thing. Yeah. But what they're not telling us about is things like the potential invasion or attack on Iran. That sort of stuff stays on the back burner. So, I think that the most important thing with Bilderberg, the most important take home is these people they're kingmakers. That's the problem, is you get people going along to the Bilderberg, and then suddenly they pop up. You've never heard of them before, and they're running the country. Interesting. Like Emmanuel Macron. He's last year, as far as I remember, I think it was the first time he'd ever been to the Bilderberg conference. Within months, he's the French president. He's come out of nowhere. Because of the fact is, the politicians nowadays are backed by the bankers at Bilderberg. If some banker comes along and says, right, I'm going to fund your new political party, a whole load of marketing, TV appearances and PR, you can go from zero to hero in just a few months. Yeah.
Yeah. Am I right, Tony, with this year's attendees that they included former US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, CEO of Airbus, Thomas Enders, and, bizarrely, Ryanair's Michael O'Leary and George Osborne?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. All those were there. I mean, one I'd point to particularly is Enders, because the Bilderberg are very clever when they put their list out. I would say devious, really. In that they'll say he's the chairman of Airbus. Well, actually, he's the chairman also of this thing called EADS, which is the biggest defence contractor in Europe. So he's not just making lovely planes for us to go on our holidays on. Right. He's also making drones. He's also making missiles. He's making, all this kind of defence equipment. So this is where it gets very, very problematic, having a secret meeting like this. Where you've got politicians sitting down with the people who will make a lot of money out of war. That's the trouble. And of course, there's US contractors there as well at these meetings.
Why would you invite somebody like Michael O'Leary then? What would be his purpose at a meeting like that?
Well, good question. I think it's probably because he's a fairly ruthless businessman. I mean, you look at Ryanair's history, it's we're going to cut costs as much as possible, cut them to the bone, and we're going to actually he's been been involved in cheap airlines is a race to the bottom. I mean Ryanair really is, I don't want to libel them, but they're not the greatest quality airline. Their staff are not the happiest. You know what I'd like if I'm flying from one place to another in an aircraft is I'd like the staff to be happy. I think that's actually quite an important part of the experience. And it's quite an important part of me trusting them to get me there in one piece, So O'Leary represents the opposite of that. What can we get away with in terms of, getting people from A to B, not breaking the law, but doing it as cheap as we possibly can. And I mean, we've seen what that led to with bad relationships between German wings and the pilot they had. They had some pilot who was complaining about the shifts he was doing were just fitting in with his life, and he decided to fly a plane into a cliff. He locked his co-pilot out of the cabin. And he just flew the plane straight down and committed suicide.
He did, taking everybody with him.
Good relations particularly in the airline business, between your staff and the person that's running it. So I don't think he's a glowing example, O'Leary, of the way that business should be done.
Looking at the conspiracy side of this briefly, and I know we can talk about this for hours, but there is a conspiracy side of this, and a lot of people are quite vocal about it. In particular, somebody who anybody who follows conspiracy theories will be very familiar with, the shock jock Alex Jones, who said, "We know you are ruthless, we know you are evil, we respect your dark power." What's he banging on about?
Well, Jones is extremely problematic. He started off as this is years ago. I mean, I'd never say I've never interviewed him, although he's interviewed me in the past about Diana and things like that. Right. He has veered far more to the far right nowadays. He's outfoxing Fox News. He started off, I suppose, in the 1990s with InfoWars. And when I first saw those sites, I thought, this is very well resourced. Alex Jones really is a kind of, I think, a doppelganger for a guy that was around until the September the 11th attacks and then was actually shot dead by the FBI, whose name is William Cooper. He did a radio show called The Hour of the Time. Right. And William Cooper, or Bill Cooper, was a former naval intelligence officer. He was working on for the admirals in the US Navy, on ships, and he was incredibly knowledgeable about the way that the world works in the military. And yes, he came up with some crackpot theories because he'd seen fake documents when he was in the military. But Alex Jones popped up on the scene and almost sort of took over Bill's role. Bill was shot dead long after the 9/11 attacks. But the amazing thing about Bill Cooper is he actually predicted the 9/11 attacks. In July 2001, he said that and this was when CNN went to interview bin Laden over in Afghanistan. Yep. On his radio show, he actually said, well, look, if CNN can go and find bin Laden, but the NSA and the US military can't find him, you know what's going on here? They're setting him up. And there'll be a big attack on the United States, and it'll be blamed on bin Laden. He said that in July 2001. So Alex Jones pops up before, actually, as a sort of, I think, a kind of fake version of Bill Cooper.
Right.
But nowadays, yeah, I mean, his way he talks about it, their evil power, we respect it. No, we don't, actually. I've got absolutely no respect for what the Bilderberg are up to. They just simply need to be exposed and closed down. And the media and the politicians are the particularly treacherous people that go there. I just think there's absolutely no reason for them to do it, unless they are both going in there and coming back and having a debate in the House of Commons about Bilderberg, which Michael Meacher did before he died, or else having an expose. Because we cannot allow our politicians and our press, which are the most important safeguards of any kind of democratic thought whatsoever, to be selling themselves to the world's most powerful bankers. It's just not on.
Fascinating stuff. Well, we could talk longer. We're sadly out of time here. So, interesting. I'll just finally quote Dennis Healey, who, of course, former party deputy leader of the Labour Party. He, when asked by John Ronson for his book Them in 2001 about the New World Order bit of all this, he says, to say we were striving for a one world government is exaggerated, but not wholly unfair, which is an interesting statement, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the final take home on this is it's feudal. This is back to medieval times. These people, particularly the bankers, are they're basically the dukes of today, the barons. We talk about the press barons, don't we? But they really are. They're invulnerable. And they don't say anything bad about their mates. And that's what Bilderberg is all about. And they're the most powerful lobby, and really lobbying all across the NATO zone, the NATO countries, which, of course, is now threatening Russia. The NATO's come right up to the Russian border, just like they said they would never do. They're right on the border now, right, through in East Germany, right up to the Russian borders and the Eastern Europe borders. So that's why I think we need to be concerned about these people, as they represent totally undemocratic power in the West, and there's no real scrutiny of them at all.
Tony, as always, you've explained it brilliantly. We thank you. We'll talk to you again in a few weeks' time. And if people just Google your name, they'll find all kinds of very interesting stuff that we're talking about, no doubt.
Cheers, Phil.